Got a good crowd today. We had over 400 people today. That's the first time in a long time, so that's a good thing. This COVID thing seems to be really dying down, we hope. Thought that last time too, didn't we? And maybe this time it'll stay that way. 1 Peter chapter 4. Last week we dealt with the last few verses of chapter 3, and we talked about how baptism is the antitype to the people in the days of the flood of Noah. Noah was a preacher of righteousness. Noah preached to those people. Most people didn't listen to what he had to say. Therefore, most people were in the temporary place of punishment awaiting judgment because of that. Peter's trying to tell us we need to take heed to the words of God and do something about it while there's time. And most definitely we do. Chapter 4 opens up and says, therefore. Therefore always means look back and see why he's going to say what he's about to say. And what he would be talking about is verse 18. When he says, therefore, Christ also suffered once for sins, the just for the unjust, that he might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh, but made alive by the Spirit. Peter is referring back to verse 18 in chapter 3 to tell us something about our Christian lives that will help us to be able to better endure everything that's going on around us. He says, therefore, since Christ suffered for us in the flesh, arm yourselves also with the same mind, that he who has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin. I want us to think about that just for a second. Christ suffered in the flesh for us. Christ endured a lot of things, didn't he? You know, sometimes we just think about the time that he was arrested to the time that he died, but wasn't there a lot more suffering that he had to endure? He endured suffering for the whole 3.5 years of his ministry. Once he began to go about and teach and preach, repent, for the kingdom of heaven's at hand, people began to persecute him. People began to ridicule him. More and more as time went by, people were very angry with him. They were upset with him. They talked about him. They tried their best to trap him. He just had to endure so many things, and a lot of those things you and I have to endure today. No, we don't have to be killed to be a Christian yet. That may come, I don't know. But we have to endure a lot of the same things as far as people trying to trap us, people trying to, talk about us, people trying to ridicule us. We have to endure those things if we're going to truly be faithful Christians. If we're going to be people that's going to take the gospel to the world, you're going to have to endure some of those things. And Peter says, I want you guys to think about Jesus. I want you to think about him, and he says, I want you to arm yourself with the same mind. If I'm going to arm myself, what do? We think about that with a weapon, right? We've got that weapon on us, and we are trained and ready to use that weapon. And he's talking about in the same sense, but we arm ourselves with a mindset. This is something that we're going to set within us, and we're going to decide, hey, this is what I'm going to be. This is what I'm going to do. No matter what comes in my life, I'm going to have this mindset. And that mindset is the mind of Christ. That's why Paul said in Philippians chapter 2, verse 5, let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus. And he says, who being in the form of God, thought it not robbery to be equal with God, but made himself of no reputation, and took upon him the form of a servant, and came in the likeness of a man. And being found in fashion as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient unto death, even the death of the cross. Peter says, I want you to have that exact same mindset. Jesus Christ came to this earth, and although he was so much more, he didn't have to be that. Although he was equal with God, he was willing to empty himself and become like a man. We've got to be humble, right? That's what that whole thing is talking about there in Philippians chapter 2. Jesus was a humble servant. He never thought himself to be haughty or arrogant, and he knew that nobody would be gained to the kingdom by having such an attitude, and you and I would do well to do the same. No one is going to be added to the kingdom when we are haughty or arrogant. We got to be humble. We got to be like Jesus. And Paul would say such a thing in Philippians 2 because in verse 3, he's talking about the fact as Christians, we've got to humble ourselves and submit to one another. And to be willing to help one another, to love one another, all of those things. But you see, if we're going to have the mind of Jesus, we've got to understand those things. The writer of Hebrews in chapter 12, verse 1 says, seeing we're compassed about by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside the weight, the sin which so easily ensnares us, and let us run with the endurance the race that is set before us. Verse 2, looking to Jesus, the author and the finisher of faith, who for the glory set before him endured the cross, despising the shame. Even though he had to endure all of those horrible, hard things, even though that he knew it was coming, he still had the mindset, I'm going to see it through. He still had the mindset, no matter what happens, I'm not going to quit. And we've got to develop that mindset. When Jesus was in the Garden of Gethsemane, he knew what was about to happen. You and I don't have that ability to know what's about to happen. But can you imagine you knew, you were in Jesus' shoes, you knew what was going to happen? What would your attitude have been? What would your reaction have been? Well, he said, Father, if it be thy will, let this cup pass from me. But nevertheless, not my will, but thy will. He's like, is there some other way? Well, that would be my first reaction. There's got to be another way, right? I've got to be able to get out of this. I've got to be able to, to find a way to wiggle, something to say, something to do. Maybe I can run and hide, whatever it may be. But I've got to get out of it. He didn't do that. And Peter is here telling us you've got to arm yourself with the mind of Christ. You've got to do that. Colossians chapter 3, verse 1, if you be risen with Christ, set your affections on things above, where Christ sitteth on the right hand of God. Set your affections on things above, not upon things of the earth. For you are dead, and your life is hid with Christ. He says, don't think about everything around you. You've got to arm yourself with a different mindset. And only when we do that will we be these people that Peter is trying to get us to be through inspiration. We've got to develop that mindset that no matter what comes our way, I'm going to be faithful. And there's great benefit from developing that mindset. Look what he says again in verse 1. Since Christ suffered for us in the flesh, arm yourselves also with the same mind, for he who has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin. Do you realize that if I could in my life develop the mindset that even if somebody comes by with a gun and is going to kill me, I'm not going to waver. I'm not going to let my faith slip at all. I'm going to stand firm even if I lose my life. Do you realize sin does not have such a pull on a person if you've got that mindset? It doesn't. Sin didn't have the same pull on Christ that it does a lot of us, and the reason being is because of his mindset. He was going to do the will of the Father, and he says, that's my food. That's my meat. That's my drink. That's the thing that sustains me in my life, is to do what God would have me to do. And if I have to suffer for it, so be it. And when we develop that mindset, we're not as tempted to sin, are we? Sin doesn't have a hold on us because our mindset is focused so much more on other things that are far more important. But I'm going to stand up here and tell you this morning, that's hard. We live in a world that pulls on you, doesn't it? I mean, everything around us, we've got all of these things we want to do and all of these things we want to acquire in our life, places we want to go, and sometimes we're so infatuated with the things right around us, sometimes that's why we are so tempted to sin, because our mindset is really focused in the wrong direction. And like I said, I'm not talking to you, I'm talking to me. It's hard to live this life. It's difficult. And that's why Peter says you've got to arm yourself with that. You've got to make a conscious effort in your life. Hey, this is what I want to do. And it's not going to come easy. It's not going to come just one day out of the blue. It's going to be something you're going to work towards every day of your life. And when you come in contact with certain situations, you've got to slowly develop that mindset. You've got to learn from your mistakes. And you should get to that point as a Christian of where God wants you to be. You know, I read an article the other day, and I thought it was good and kind of went hand in hand with this as growing as a Christian. You ever heard the saying the church is a hospital for sinners, not a museum for saints? And I've used that before. But I read this article that come out with Focus Press, and I thought it was excellent. And within that article it says, do you stay in a hospital for your whole life? You ever thought about that? A lot of times we want to hold on to that statement, and we want to use it and say, well, everybody's just broken and sick, and you know, this is just a hospital, and everybody here needs to be in the hospital. Do you stay in the hospital every day of your life? If you do, you are flat broke, right? You don't have any money. You don't have anything. This church should be a hospital for sinners. But brethren, we don't stay in a hospital forever. We're supposed to get better, right? Jesus says, I have come to heal the brokenhearted. He's come to get people better. He's come to raise people up from the point that they were and bring them to the place that they need to be. And church, that's what we've got to do. And that's what this is about. This is grown up, mature things. It's not basic things. You don't become a Christian and the second day you're able to give your life for Christ. Probably that's not going to happen, is it? But you should develop that more as you go along, and your faith should build and grow till you can endure most anything that is thrown at you. Because you work on that mindset every day of your life. You fill your mind with good things. Good things, Philippians 4 verse 8. He says, only put those good things in. And when you do that, you can get to this point. Don't let anyone tell you that you are to remain broken your whole life. Because if you do, then Jesus is not doing a very good job. If you're broken after 40 years of being a Christian, just as broke as you were when you started, Jesus has failed. Or you have failed. And I'm going to give you the answer. Jesus doesn't fail, does he? He doesn't do that. He's always right. So we need to think about that. We need to work on that every day and develop that mindset, and sin will not be near as attractive as it once was. And I found that out in my life. The more good, the more Bible I put in my life, the more things I'm trying to do for him, sin doesn't enter my mind near as much as it does when, you know, I'm out here trying to make $1 or whatever, you know, having a big time. It's different. So we've got to really consider that and put that within our mind. He says that he no longer should live the rest of his time in the flesh for the lusts of men, but for the will of God. He says when you develop that mindset and you become the person that God wants you to be, you don't live the rest of your time here on this earth for the lust of the flesh. That's not what your goal is. That's not where you desire to be. Jesus endured all of that suffering, all of that pain, all of that ridicule because he knew the end result was going to be good, right? He knew it was absolutely necessary. He knew when he was praying in the garden, God, I've got to do this. I don't want to do this, and I know it's going to be painful and it's going to hurt, but I have got to endure this because this is the greater good. This is what the people need. You and I develop that mindset. I have got to do this. I've got to develop this mindset. I've got to get through whatever hard patch it is in my life because the end result is going to be good. It's going to be good. I don't live my life, or at least I shouldn't live my life the way the world lives their life. Peter says, you don't spend your time for the lusts of men. Men have a lot of lust, don't they? A lot of lust. You know, the pride of all that pride that's talked about, and all the lust of the eyes, lust of the flesh, the pride of life, all of those things, we struggle with that. And the world lives their life for those things. The world wants all of that they can get, but as Christians, we don't live their life for that. We live our life for God. Verse 3, he says, for we have spent enough of our past lifetime in doing the will of the Gentiles. Notice Peter uses the word we. I think that's good for a preacher to always use the word we, because none of us are above the other. I can tell you I have spent enough of my life living in the wrong way. If I've spent one day of my life living in the wrong way, that's too much, right? We spent enough of that. We've got to realize that. You know, people waste so many years. I have known people that obey the gospel when they get older, and they have a great regret in their life, and that regret is, why didn't I do this a long, long time ago? You know, I've wasted my life, people have told me. I've wasted my life, you know, living in a way that I shouldn't have lived, and there's no enjoyment found therein. You don't find people of the world that are truly content and happy. Not really. Oh, they think they find it, and Solomon looked for it diligently, didn't he? He looked everywhere he could look, but he couldn't find it. He said there's only true happiness and contentment in doing the will of the Lord. So you and I have got to understand, we got to give that up. We've done it enough. And Peter, talking to these people, he knew that every one of them had a past. All of us have got a past, but your past only influences your future when you let it. You got to let go of the past. Paul says, I forget those things which are behind, Philippians 3:13, and I press forward to those things which are ahead. I forget it. He could have lived with regrets. He could have wallowed around in self-pity and sorrow. I mean, could he not? You imagine if you'd killed Christians, and all of a sudden you become a Christian. That'd be hard to let go of your past, wouldn't it? Peter says, you spent enough time in that. Forget it. You can't change your past. You can't change it. But you can turn, and you can do better in your future. And that's what Peter's trying to remind us here. Get rid of that. You spent enough time. He says you've walked in lewdness. New King James says lewdness. A lot of translations are going to say lasciviousness. We've talked about that. Don's talked about that in lessons here recently. But I want to tell you what Thayer says lewdness is, or lasciviousness. Unbridled lust. This is something that is external. This is something that people are seeing. We're going to talk about the internal next when we talk about lust. But lasciviousness is just unbridled lust. You got something that you desire within you, and you just let it go. You let it go. And you follow after whatever it is, and isn't that how the world lives today? Follow after whatever their heart desires, whatever it may be. He says it's an excess. It's an absence of restraint. It's indecency. And that's why all of these modern dance are talked about as lasciviousness so much. And then he uses the word licentiousness. Licentiousness. And that's part of the definition of lasciviousness. And I looked up that word licentiousness, and it's disregarding sexual restraints. Does our world today disregard sexual restraints? Absolutely. They disregard any restraint at all. Do whatever you want to do, whenever you want to do it, with whomever it is. It doesn't matter. And that's what lasciviousness is. And Peter says, you've spent enough of your past doing that. You can't do that anymore. You've got to throw that away, and you've got to focus on something far better. As Christians, we are to be a people who are a people restrained. Does not the Bible teach us over and over again we've got to rein in those lusts, those desires that we have? It does. He says you can't do that. He goes on the next and he says not only lewdness but lust. Lust would be something that goes on inside of you. Peter says you've got to get rid of the external things, those desires that you don't even try to restrain, and you act upon them and you do all of these things. But he says it's more than that. He says you've got to get a hold on those internal things. Lust there would, according to Thayer, would be a desire, a craving, a longing, a desire for what is forbidden. It goes on up here, and it's something that you think about and you want. And James says in James 1 verse 13, each one of us, we are tempted when we're drawn away by what? What does he say? Our own lusts. Does every person in this room have different lusts? Sometimes when we think of lust, we simply think about sexual things. But that definitely falls hand in hand, but it's much, much more than that. You can lust after a lot of different things in your life. And when you're drawn away by your own lust, whatever that may be, then you give into that sin when you allow yourself to give into it. And when sin is full grown, James says it brings forth death. You'll find yourself neck deep in it, and it's hard to get out of then. But if we could control it while it's up here, what happens? You've heard it before. Anything that's up here is between who? You and who? God. When you let go of it, it's everywhere, right? It's everywhere. So if we can learn to control it up here, what happens? It doesn't come out anywhere else. Didn't Jesus say all the murder and envyings and strife, all of those things proceed from the heart, right? And the heart is your biblical mind. And if we can learn to get a hold of that mind, and we do that by, go back to verse 1, arm yourself with the mind of Christ. We do that when we set our focus, hey, I'm going to be His. Come what may, doesn't matter. And when you have that laser focus, you can let go of a lot of these things. You can get better at them as time goes on. I won't say that you'll never sin, but you'll get better at it. You'll get better at avoiding temptation. You'll get better at overcoming temptation. See, those are two different things. As Christians, we should try to avoid temptation, but sometimes it's going to find us no matter what we try to do. Temptation found Jesus. Was Jesus looking for it? Absolutely not. But it still found him, but he had the strength to overcome it because of his mindset. So we got to learn to control those lusts, those things used to control us. Next, he says drunkenness. Drunkenness simply means an excess of wine. I don't think I really have to go into great detail, do I? I mean, if you're just an alcoholic, I mean, you can't be that and go to heaven. You can't practice that. Let me rephrase that. There's a lot of people that are alcoholics and they choose not to practice it. But you can't be a practicing alcoholic and go to heaven. If you don't believe me, go to Galatians 5, go to 1 Corinthians 6, 9 through 11, go to a host of other passages. You can't be that. And we understand that, and there's not going to be any argument there. But he goes on to say revelries. Revelries. Revelry is, according to Thayer, letting loose. Letting loose. And he had a big, long explanation, and I went to Vines, and I looked it up, and carousing would be the word that you would have to look up there in Vines, and it was the whole big story, and what it amounts to is it's people that are partiers. They let loose, you know. What do people do at parties? You can let your imagination run wild. He says you don't be that. You know, you can't be a down-and-out drunk. And he says you can't go to heaven and be a partier, so you can't be a guy that lets loose on the weekend and gets loaded on Saturday, but just on Saturday. Still can't be that. But what about the third thing? The third thing he says is drinking parties. Well, he says you can't be a down-and-out drunk, and I can't do that. You can't be the party guy. He's not an alcoholic, but he's a guy that likes to party from time to time. You know, you can't be that. Third thing he says you can't be is one that is a drinking party. If you've got a King James, it's going to say banqueting. What do you think banqueting means? A social drinker. Why would he mention all three? Doesn't that cover it from every aspect? I can't be a drunk. I can't be just the party guy on the weekend. And he says, in fact, you can't be a social drinker. He said, well, I don't like that idea. You know, the Bible just condemns drunkenness. 1 Peter 4:3 condemns all three. And you have to take that up with God. When you drink, you allow your influence on other people to be lowered. There's not a person I know that believes in social drinking that would want me to walk in and see them with a beer at their table. Yes, sir. goes hand in hand with Romans 1, verse 32. You know, it's not just the people that commit these horrific things that are against God, but if you extend your hand of fellowship to them, he says you're worthy of death just like they are. And that goes right with what he's talking about. A Christian has no business hanging out at a bar, playing pool, or whatever it may be. That's not what we're about. That's not where our light is going to shine. Your light doesn't shine if you're right there in the middle of everybody else, because what do they think? If I'm right there in the middle of everybody else that's drinking, what do they think I'm doing? Well, absolutely they think I'm doing it too. You know, how many of you told your kids when you were growing up, if you're in the car with them, you're just as guilty, right? Now, you guys have preached that just like I have, you know. And where'd we get that from? God, right? And that's true. Somebody robs a bank, your mom or dad ever told you this, somebody robs a bank and you're in the car, you're just as guilty as they are, and you're going to get in trouble just like they are. And that's true. God here condemns all three. You know, people are going to try to find a loophole and find a way around it, but you're not going to find it. Why would he use all three events? That's it. You're either a drunk, or you're just a weekend party guy, or you're a social drinker. There's no other way to be a drinker. That's it. And he condemns all three. He says, you spend enough time doing that, you got to let it go. You got to let it go. You can't be mine. You can't have the mind of Christ. You can't overcome all of these things that's coming your way, and there's a lot coming their way here in 1 Peter. The destruction of Jerusalem was rapidly approaching. They were going to endure some super hardships, and he's trying to get them ready. Church, there's things coming our way, I'm afraid. This world is becoming more and more hostile to Christianity. We better get ready. We better get ready. The world's not like it was when a lot of you guys were young, and you know that. It's not like it was. It's becoming more difficult for a Christian. So we better have the right mindset. Not only that, the last one, he says abominable idolatries. And that would go with any kind of idolatry that would be hateful towards God. And you can go to Barnes and Clark and some of these guys, and it's going to talk about these idolatrous feasts where alcohol was used and all kind of sexual perversion in these feast, idolatrous feast. And he says, you can't have any part of that. A Christian abstains from every appearance of evil. You stay away from all of those things. He says, you spent enough, you wasted enough of your life doing that, and you can't do it anymore. He says, verse 4, in regard to these, they think it strange that you do not run with them in the same flood of dissipation, speaking evil of you. He says, in regard to these, talking about those sinful things, those things that we just talked about, those people that participate in those things, and those people that's just their way of life. And in fact, when you look around, isn't that what most people, that's their way of life. I'm amazed that most people in the world, they just use four-letter words like it's just everyday language, right? Most people in the world, they don't think anything about doing anything. They don't think anything about moving in with someone or getting married 6 times. And most people in the world, they don't really think about that. It's just okay. And that's just common everyday life for them. And Peter here is saying, those people, they think it's strange when you don't do those things. People ever looked at you like you were weird because you didn't do the things they did? They ever treated you like an outcast because you wouldn't go the places that they go? Maybe you were invited to something and you said, I can't do that. I won't do that. And then maybe they ridicule you or they laugh at you. And then maybe it gets to the point that they won't even invite you, and I take that as the greatest compliment. If you're going to have something that's not right and you don't invite me, I think, well, they know I'm not going to do it, so hey, that's great. I'm glad they think that of me. And that's what Peter's trying to say here. He said these people, they think it's strange that you don't run with them. I want you to notice that word run. That word is an eagerness. People think that really if you're invited to do something evil, you should be eager. That's what people think, to do it. That you should be honored. That you should just be happy and you will be there with bells on, as the old saying goes. And they think it's strange when you don't act like that. And the problem is, though, is sometimes we don't want to be thought of as strange, do we? And especially our young people, it's so hard. It's so hard on our young people when all of these things are going on around them. And they're left there to fend for themselves, or so it seems to them. And what do? It's hard. It's hard to overcome temptation. I didn't overcome temptation very much when I was a teenager. I didn't. I run with the wrong crowd, and I did a lot of the wrong things. And when I finally decided to quit those things, then the people that I ran with, they were mad at me. And then they wouldn't talk to me anymore. And because they thought it was strange that I didn't want to do those things anymore. If the world thinks I'm strange and God thinks I'm okay, you know what? I'll take what God says. Doesn't matter what the world says. I'm not going to stand before the world someday in judgment, and that's what he's about to get into. You and I need to worry more about what God says and don't worry about the people here. He says, run with them to the same flood of dispensation or dissipation. The King James says the same excess of riding. Excess is a problem. Ephesians 5:18, be not drunk with spirits or wine, whereas is excess, but be filled with the Spirit. Anything where there's excess, a lot of times you get in trouble. And don't allow what others think about you to influence what decisions you make. 2 more verses, and we'll get to a good stopping point. They will give an account to him who is ready to judge the living and the dead. He says, don't worry about what other people think. Don't worry about if they talk about you, if they laugh at you, and just don't worry about it. God's going to handle that. He's in control of this whole thing. And sometimes we get upset and we get our feelings hurt, and maybe sometimes we want to lash out. Or he says, God's got it under control. God's going to judge everybody someday. 2 Corinthians 5:10, for we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ and give account of the things done in our body, whether they be good or whether they be evil. I want to be on the good side of that thing. I want to be on the good side. You see, because Jesus Christ, 2 Timothy 4, verse 1, he's going to judge the quick and the dead at his appearing and at his kingdom. I want to be on his good side. Everybody's going to stand there. And I want to be on the right side of that thing. And that's what he's reminding us of. Last verse, and I'll be quiet. He says, for this reason, the gospel was preached also to those who are dead, that they might be judged according to men in the flesh, but live according to God in the Spirit. I'm going to be honest with you. Verse 6 is kind of a difficult verse. And commentators are all over the place as to exactly what it means. But I think there's 2 words, in my opinion, that are key there. The word was and the word are. One word is past tense. One word is present tense. So I need to look at it as such, and I need to think back to what Peter was saying in chapter 3, verse 19 and 20. He's talking about 2 different time periods. He says Christ preached to the spirits in prison when once the divine long-suffering of God waited in the days of Noah. Christ preached in the days of Noah. Those people were currently in prison. I believe in 1 Peter 4, verse 6, for this reason the gospel was preached. The gospel has been preached in the past to all of these people within the world. And he says, those that now that are dead. Some of those people have passed on. And what he's trying to do is he's trying to encourage us to follow in their footsteps, if you will. He says those people that heard the gospel in the past and now they have passed on, they may have been judged according to men in the flesh. They may have been mocked and ridiculed, and they may have been laughed at and scorned, and in this time period they may have been beaten. They may have even been a martyr. He says, I want you to look to those people. He says they were judged according to men in the flesh. Notice what he says, but they live according to God in the Spirit. I don't know about you, but that's encouraging to me. Those people that have gone on before me, that have had to endure horrible things that I can't even fathom, they may have had some difficult times with men. But Peter says they live. They live with God. They live because of God. And that's motivation. That I want to do the exact same thing, and so should you. I appreciate your attention this morning. That's a good stopping point. We'll pick up at verse 7. I won't be here next week. We're flying out to Kansas to see my daughter. They bought a new house, their first house, and they're so excited to show us. So we're going to fly out, and Don will teach next week. But 2 weeks, we'll pick back up. You're dismissed.